Thank you. Our final presentation before we break for lunch is Alex McDonald. Alex is the client manager for meat, fish and poultry at Kantar. Alex has been at Kantar for 4 years, having graduated from the University of Leicester in 2012. Alex, please. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for that introduction. First of all, an apology. 10 minutes after being told we don't like big data, I put this title on with big data in it. But I don't actually disagree with the broad point that there is absolutely no consensus at what point a particular volume of data becomes big. And so really what I have to do is talk you through the data that I use and the technology that I work with. We've already had some fantastic discussion of the use of data in what I would probably call, in a very uneducated city boy sort of way, the kind of first half of the product journey, if you like. And I'll focus a little bit more on the second half, and I'll do that through our consumer panels, and 2 of them in particular. So the one on the left there, fortunately that's already been introduced. The second David of the first session, David Nielsen, with some chicken data that came out of that panel. That is a representative group of 30,000 people throughout the UK, 30,000 households, excuse me, around the country, that gives information about what they buy. That's all then weighted up, aggregated up, and it allows us to make claims about things like market share, who buys what, with what, when, and as you saw, exciting things about the volume of chicken consumption, in particular retailers, as we saw a little bit earlier. That then combines with our consumption panel, which kind of completes the journey. So that's all about households twice every 6 months filling in full information about what everything they bring home from store, what happens to it afterwards. So from that, we get a fairly full understanding of not quite farm to fork, the kind of first half's already been really well taken care of, but certainly shelf to fork. And the advantages of all that, first of all, from a kind of data perspective, I get to put some really exciting numbers up, tracking large numbers of both physical purchases, trips into store to buy stuff essentially, and then 40,000 a year of what we would call these full diary weeks, so where we have full information about everything that happens within a household. And obviously, more importantly, it helps us understand quite a lot about the market and what happens within it and how our shoppers and the country as a whole react and change, I suppose. So there's 3 kind of broad buckets of this. The first one is how our relationship with the food on our plate has changed, and that's the one I'll talk about first. Second of all, we'll look a bit more about our relationship to the food and grocery, in store, and how that's changing. And finally, we'll look a bit about how all this is affected by changing the world around us. And the particular example we're talking about is a very metaphorical squeeze on wallets from that image. So first of all, we think about how the plate is changing and how we eat, what we eat, and how that's changing. So this begins with a little bit of a history of the British dinner plate, I suppose. So in 1954, I won't ask how many people remember, the British government ends rationing. So for 65 years now, the government has no longer legally limited the amount of food we can buy. However, and we now have what it could be argued in terms of government policy, they're trying to address the opposite problem. Rather than not having enough food, concerns around overconsumption. How this all addresses itself is really in one number, and it's about the proportion of our money as a country in terms of household income that's spent on grocery. So back in the 1960s, this was at 25%. A number of social changes. I mean, obviously we've talked a lot about better technology in farming, but also things like the rising cost of housing means that number now falls to 8%. And that is a fundamental change in our relationship with food that we buy in store. At the same time, other things are changing too. So again, if we go back 60, 70 years, the majority of the food we ate was what you would call traditional British food. In 1957, April the 1st, 1957, was the most famous April Fool's joke of all time. Richard Dimbleby on the BBC, presenting a documentary about spaghetti trees. Hundreds of people ringing in the BBC to ask for advice on spaghetti cultivation. And that's what the world was then, but it changes. By 1987, the GB fresh and dry pasta market is worth £53 million. And over time, things change, usually led by out-of-home first, then kind of graduating through cooking sauces, and then more and more things being cooked from scratch, and more cuisines, being cooked from scratch. What this has done has led to a fundamental change in the structure of the British dinner plate, where we've gone from being what we would call kind of in a data way assembled meals, but what most people would call meat and two veg, into a country that eats more dishes. And we're now a majority dish society. And that is a real fundamental change in the structure of our plates. And it really, really matters if you're in any form of protein industry, because you're not so much competing for the center of plate, you're competing for particular dishes. So for instance, if you're a pork supplier, you now want to try and make the argument that the traditional Bolognian recipe for spaghetti bolognese has pork in it as well as beef. It's making more arguments about particular curries working better with particular forms of meat. And it also leads to an extent, we saw some of this slightly earlier, fundamental changes in what we buy. So obviously some of this is price driven, as David discussed earlier, but it was also driven by this and a change in the structure of our plates, that in the summer of 2018, for the first time, from a volume perspective, chicken, from a take-home grocery perspective, overtook red meat in that measure. And at the same time, as our kind of expectations are higher about the dishes we eat, it's generally acknowledged that our skill in the kitchen hasn't kept pace at all. And at the same time, there's been another fundamental change in the way we interact with food. And that's the rise of the one-person occasion. So more and more, a number of social changes, meaning more and more meal occasions, there is only one person present. And what these two things in combination mean is a fundamental change in the nature of what convenience means. Essentially, it's about a transition from being about speed to being about ease. So a foil tray that is stuck in the oven for 45 minutes is a more convenient proposition than a recipe that's going to require 10 to 15 minutes of active preparation, of actively being chopped up, being fried, whatever. And what that looks like in the form of slides, of data, is these two charts. So over on the left there, we've got quick to prepare. So that is the proportion of occasions on our usage panel where speed was a motivator for the consumer deciding to consume that particular product. And on the right, ease as a motivation for consumers deciding to consume a particular thing is rising. And this is really, really important because fundamentally, convenience is one of the three reasons why anyone consumes anything. Broadly speaking, all these reasons for eating or drinking any form of grocery can be bucketed as either giving enjoyment, making people healthier, or being easy. And a change to one of those is really, really important. And so it's not surprising that the market responds to that. So the general pattern here is kind of outside innovator, groceries respond. So growth of sort of takeaway aggregate sites. We see in response more and more retailers offering express delivery. Likewise, still relatively small if we think in terms of the number of people engaging with it. A lot of food boxes rather still not universal geographic spread. but again, another trend, and again, another one that we see retailers respond to. And all of this is about targeting a shopper that has high expectations of a number of cuisines, that potentially doesn't quite have the skill, and also has an understanding of convenience that is about engaged time rather than time itself. Quite happy to wait an hour for something to be ready or to arrive via delivery service, as long as during that hour they don't have to do anything. So that brings me on to my sort of second piece, which is looking at the relationship between the food and drink that we buy in store and how shoppers interact with that now. And this is now talking about values and value, and the value we attach to our values. First thing really important to say is that values aren't necessarily ethical. So people can value their time, and so an attempt by a retailer to respond to that. The sort of flagship Sainsbury's in Holborn, just down the road from the head office, experimenting with till-free grocery shopping. But broadly speaking, if you're talking in the last sort of 12, 18 months about retailers responding to what they see as their shoppers' values, it's hard to escape plastic. I will just pause and drink from the my fourth, I think, single-use plastic bottle of the morning. And the good thing about having a consumer panel is that you can, first of all, ask what people think. And if we just look there as we move from left to right, bigger groups showing increased concern about the amount of plastic packaging on what they buy in store. But the good thing here is we can find out how many people are actually willing to put their money where their mouth is, as it were. And arguably unsurprisingly, that number gets a little bit smaller, and this is the same for many different values. We have these values, but the amount of value we attach to them when it comes to actually paying more money isn't always there. And of course, we see that in our own industries too. They've been discussed by speakers that have far more knowledge about their history than I do, but we have these labels that we can put on our products. Generally speaking, I know David Nielsen talked about this earlier, these remain relatively small in the context of enormous markets like all of GB Poultry. And the general rule really is that these sorts of changes come from the top down rather than the bottom up. So when there is a change in availability, in distribution points, you do see moves. So most of the growth in eggs in the last 4 years has become from free range. But again, this is more about availability than conscious shopper choice, because where there is a choice, if the benefits aren't clearly communicated, value can trump values. The one exception to that, the one value that we value higher than anything else and that we will pay for, is our own desire to keep our bodies in good working order for as long as possible. And that's health. So almost a third, of all food occasions, health is a motivator of what people decide to buy. And we're now looking at a value on this of over £20 billion. And as I say, it's one of our core 3 reasons why anyone consumes anything. It's the smallest of the 3, but it has grown over the last 5 years. And importantly, for any form of marketing and things like that, the premium attached to health grows. So this is the average extra price, the value in an occasion rather, when health is a reason why. So this has continued to rise up until the end of 2018. The one caveat and the watch out is, I'm going to talk more about kind of what we'd call recessionary behaviors and things in a bit, but people tend to move away from health. It tends to drop as a concern when people get a little bit more cautious about money, and sort of traditional comfort foods tend to do a little bit better. The other thing to talk about, obviously there was a great question at the end of the last presentation about this, but the other thing to talk about in the concept of health is meat-free meals and plant-based meals. Plant-based, of course, being a much smaller market, but both of them seeing a lot of growth in the last 4 years. And now quite a lot of cash attached now to plant-based meals, meat-free and plant-based meals, excuse me. And first of all, a little bit of a look at who's driving this, and from a kind of the stereotypical expectation would be younger shoppers. And when we look at what you might call the core of this trend, we've already talked about vegans, and that is probably, as you'd expect, it does bias towards younger demographics, and particularly younger female demographics. But the thing to remember about all plant-based meals, if we look at the demographic split for that by age, broadly speaking, it biases younger a little bit, but broadly speaking, it reflects the country as a whole. And there's a very good reason for that, is that broadly speaking, it is the country as a whole. 86% of plant-based meals are eaten by non-vegans, 89% of meat-free meals are eaten by non-vegetarians. And this is a really important and a really big opportunity for the poultry industry. So the majority of meat reduction behaviour is motivated by health rather than welfare. So there is a massive opportunity here in terms of communicating health benefits around both poultry meat and eggs to actually win this spend, because the overwhelming majority of spend going on meat-free meals, it's not all healthy, like a margarita pizza is a meat-free meal, but a lot of it is. And this is spend that, as a poultry industry, it's as far as could possibly be from off limits, because the primary motivation, as we said, one of the core reasons why anyone does anything is health. The other piece to remember on that, first of all, we know that actually this isn't a challenge for the egg and poultry industry, it's really an opportunity. The other thing to remember, and we've already talked about this to some extent, is it's still quite small. So the overall increase in the number of, I might use the phrase outright vegetarians, is quite small. The big group are flexitarians, and flexitarians are overwhelmingly motivated by health. So these are the groups you can talk to. And 90%, and even within that, 90% of them, 90% of households rather, there's no flexitarians present. So these trends remain relatively small. And it's also worth flagging that over 96% of main meal occasions contain some form of animal protein. So this is a trend to be aware of, but it remains small. And if poultry and eggs are marketed well, and the health benefits are well communicated, it really should be seen as an opportunity rather than a threat. So my final of my three sort of buckets of understanding shopper behaviour is about understanding how shoppers respond to changes in the world around them. So from my perspective, I'm interested in consumers and how consumers respond to these sorts of changes. Whether these changes are Brexit or are sort of subprime mortgages or whatever is, to some extent for me, secondary. And what's interesting is the impact of it on consumer confidence. So we're looking at consumer confidence across Europe. This is a trended chart, so if any country shows movement towards the horizontal axis but still below, it doesn't mean things are getting better, it means they're getting worse, slower. And broadly speaking, consistently across Europe, consumer confidence has been in decline. And this has a number of implications for the grocery market, but it's important to remember, actually, not all of them are bad. So we know that shoppers are concerned about the price of their food and drink. It is the biggest concern in the context of, in the context of Brexit, the biggest concern they had was the price of supermarket food and drink. But the crucial thing is, when you ask them the second question, which is where are they likely to reduce their spend, it becomes one of the smallest. And in reality, we know from previous times of economic uncertainty, those two bars at the bottom there which show the biggest likelihood of cutting back spend, that spend doesn't disappear. The nice romantic evening or the nice family meal, that doesn't go away. It just comes back into supermarket food and drink. Another opportunity here to kind of test kind of media attention around stockpiling and the extent to which we see it in our grocery data. And the answer is we don't see very little. We see very little at all. If you look at categories where you'd expect stocking up behaviour to be shown, like canned goods, from our perspective, frozen, there's very little evidence of that. Yet would probably be the obvious caveat. But we are in a time of declining consumer confidence. And the best indicator we have of this is what happened last time, I suppose. Broadly speaking, if I need to manage the amount of spend I as a household am spending on grocery, I have 4 levers I can pull. 2 of them are really easy to do, and 2 of them are a little bit harder. So the 2 easy ones are product choice, so that's the magenta, that's the biggest negative in terms of people reducing their spend, managing their spend. And the second big line is green, it's about promotional choice. So 2008, 2009, people try and reduce their spend by buying cheaper products. There's no farm brands, there's less tiering in this world, but there is opportunity to trade down through tiers, out of brands into own label. And broadly speaking, that's how people manage their spend. The other 2 are a lot harder to shift. So generally speaking, grocery volumes actually go up in times of consumer confidence because volume is won from out of home. And the final one, store choice, is also a very difficult thing to shift. Broadly speaking, the biggest driver of store choice is proximity, and that doesn't really change. And the fundamental truth that I will probably say a few times in my last sort of few minutes is that people still need to eat, so volumes tend to remain quite stable. We look at our 2 easiest ways to manage our spend here. So we've got buying cheaper products. It's a very different world now, obviously. There are far more tiers. There's far more of what you might call a kind of complex own label offer. Promotions will be another one. We've had many, many years of promotional de-escalation. To what extent will that continue? Or will retailers set that up as a way that shoppers can manage their spend? Remains an open question. Store choice is another one that kind of needs a caveat on it because we expect that proximity will always be the biggest driver of store choice. But it's worth remembering last time we had consumer confidence, Aldi and Lidl had nothing like the share or the number of stores they do now. So you never know. The final 2, we expect shoppers to show more prudence. So there's 2 pieces there. One is these kind of premium occasions moving out of home. So there's stories in the news every week about struggles in the mid-market casual dining sector, and actually premium in-store doing quite well. And finally, as I alluded to earlier, health tends to take a little bit of a back seat as there's a swing back to playing it safe and sort of comfort foods. So we're back now to our 4 ways people manage their spend. Promotions still aren't a way that people can reduce their spend because broadly speaking, we're still de-escalating. The easiest way for people to manage their spend, therefore, is product choice, is trading down through tiers. And the middle 2 are still quite difficult to shift, with the exception of the last 3 months when we were annualising against the exceptional summer of 2018 and a lot of extra volume going on things like ice cream and alcohol. And we do see volume tend to rise. So already we've seen 1.2 billion extra in-home meals. In the year at peak in 2008, that was at 2 billion. So that's the road we're on in terms of more and more spend and volume coming back into the home, both in terms of these kind of premium special occasions now being through people making the most of what they can get in store, but also through batch cooking. So a growth of big scratch-cooked occasions and then feeding people throughout the week, which again is a direct challenge to out of home because this is a direct steal from the supermarket meal deal into what we would call the big shop. So in terms of what all that means for us, broadly speaking, we'd expect people to find ways to save money in the same store. That's the easiest way for people to manage their spend, as promotions still remain a bit of an unknown. Store choice too is a little bit of an unknown. Generally, it's the hardest thing for a household to do, but Aldi and Lidl keep opening more stores, and it is a different world to 2008, 2009 in that sense. We'd expect people to shop around a little bit more, expect people to eat in home more, and that is a benefit for what you might call the premium in-home channel. So things like dining for two, things like other sorts of special offers like that. And finally, you can get a move away from health, as shoppers are a little bit more cautious, as if they've got a bit less consumer confidence, they're more mindful of waste, and particularly if it's a family food not getting eaten. So I've slightly gone over, just quickly to wrap up with a very sort of having it both ways sort of comment. In some ways, shoppers are incredibly complicated and they react to different things in different ways, but in other ways, they're quite simple. Broadly speaking, anyone eats anything for 3 reasons: because it's easy, because it's healthy, or it's tasty, and that's still true. And tasty is a really important one, particularly with the meat, fish, and poultry. Taste and quality is, I think, responsible for around about 90% of occasions. So quality won't go away, and even more so, as I said, as consumer confidence declines and more of these premium occasions come back in store. Value tends to trump values, and when there isn't a clear benefit to the consumer communicated, the exception to that is our own health, which is the value that has more power than anything else, and we see that in the move towards meat-free occasions, overwhelmingly motivated by health rather than any other ethical consideration. And health there is this massive opportunity for the chicken and egg industry. This move to meat-free, as I said, it's overwhelmingly health-driven, and there is an opportunity there. We've seen that spend move out of red meat. Absolutely correct to say some of it's cost-driven, some of it's dish-driven, but health is a really important driver as well. Fundamentally as well, to finish, we can expect the unexpected to an extent, but there are ways that we can help shoppers manage their spend, because broadly speaking, they want to be able to buy your products, and because fundamentally grocery is quite a recession-proof market, because, as I said, people do still need to eat. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alex. Great insight there, and well delivered, because you've got a wealth of information and data, and trying to get that across is challenging. So excellent. Well done, you. Can I open up to questions, please? I think we'll defer, Alex, to Slido. Does your monitoring, the panel that you use, indicate that consumers are averse to use of technology in food production? So continuing our theme of technology, we had a question earlier about, does that scare consumers? Have you got a particular insight into that, please?
People aren't very good at predicting how they'll react to things. So a good example is if you ask people, how would you feel about paying 5 pence for a plastic bag? Whenever it was sort of 10 years ago, you'd get quite a negative response. But if that's how the world changes, that's what people do. There's nothing that I'm aware of. I think generally, like, understanding of food production generally, technology or otherwise, isn't brilliant. So, yeah, sorry, it's a tricky one for me to answer.
No, that's fine. Thank you. Thank you, Alex. Thank you very much. Have we got any questions from the floor? No, can I just ask you a quick one, if I may, Alex, before we conclude? You mentioned that shoppers are concerned about plastic. Have you got any insight into if they've got any concerns over soya, particularly as, you know, it's very topical at the moment, deforestation?
Yeah.
Have you done any work on that? Have you done any work on alternative proteins that Steve Pritchard talked about earlier?
Again, I think the general rule that concerned but not yet willing to pay extra for anything without it is usually the general rule with any kind of ethical consideration. And that is probably where we are on that front, I would say.
It ties into the question there on the board, Alex. How much of consumer choice driven by environmental concerns? Animal welfare maybe is one driver, concerns over the environment another driver for behaviour?
It's there, but certainly, for instance, as I said, in terms of meat-free, broadly it's about health. So you almost always, there needs to be some kind of motivating factor around a sort of selfish motivation almost. Whether that's, so for instance, looking at something like organic, so someone's interested in something being organic because that is good for them in the most part in terms of influencing larger numbers of people. It has to be, environmental issues and health issues are related, but for most people, personal health will always trump it as the big value. And there's little evidence of significant number of people paying extra where there's because there isn't often a clear dichotomy. So, for instance, with my old world, to talk about bananas, there's very few retailers that stock fair trade and non-fair trade bananas. You have the retailers kind of make the choice for you. So there's a limited sample of where there is that sort of choice, but the general rule, as I said, is an unwillingness by shoppers to pay more, but there is a concern.
Okay, thank you. Can we get a microphone to Daniel Parker, please? And whilst we're doing that, Alex, can we just take that final question on the board there? We emphasise, we put a lot of trust, focus in provenance and meet the farmer and our high standards and everything that underpins UK food production. But if consumers are time poor, does that make a jot of difference to them?
Overwhelmingly within meat, fish and poultry, the biggest driver of choice of a product is about enjoyment and is about quality. I'm not an expert in terms of marketing or labelling or anything like that, but we'd expect that to become bigger, as I say, when consumers, when there's a fall in consumer confidence, the premium end of grocery tends to do well because spends one from out of home. So I would say the way a shopper integrates with a label on a packet is quite a long way from my area of expertise. But having said that, finding out the way to do it is still immensely valuable because promoting quality is of massive importance because taste and health are the core things that drive the majority of these purchase decisions.
Thank you. Good answer. Thank you. Really appreciate that. That gives us something to build on. Final question from Daniel Parker, please.
Well, Gary, my question was going to be along the similar lines, actually. It was really, we've been talking about promoting the industry this morning and getting our message across. So the key question is, are we giving the right message? Is the message actually really what we need to be focusing on? Health, convenience, and taste. Is that the message that we really need to take away from you today about what consumers want?
I think so, yeah. But that would be true of, I think, any, well, maybe not health in all cases, but for the majority of food products, I would say definitely yes. There's taste overwhelmingly is the driver of most sort of centre-of-plate decisions. Health is a really important defensive message for chicken to make sure that spend that's coming out of where people have concerns about red meat, that's staying in the wider meat sector, and it's a massive opportunity. And then convenience is more one to understand that convenience is now much more about engaged time than time. So broadly speaking, yes, I think.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Alex. We will break for lunch very shortly. Before we do that, I'd just like to thank our excellent lineup of speakers this morning. give some real insight into the challenges, opportunities that we face as a sector. Please spread out over lunch. We've got food service areas amongst the trade stand, so please engage, please enjoy your lunch. Please be back here for 2:15, where we will start with our Young Guns session this afternoon. Thank you very much for your attention and your questions this morning.